Welcome everybody to our webinar today. As always, we're going to wait just a few minutes. It's noon and we're going to get started, but we're going to let everybody kind of get into the webinar and then we will start. But if you've come to see the North Carolina Charter Schools Undermining Quality Education for All webinar, you are at the right place. And to get us going today, I want to start by thanking you for attending. This webinar today is based on this report that we've just completed. And we have with us today helping us talk about what's going on with charter schools in North Carolina. We have Dr. Heather Coons, who is the Communication and Research Director for the Public Schools First NC. Joining me also, we have Professor Barbara Fetters, who is our guest today, who worked with us on this report and gave us a lot of insight and resources. She is an associate professor at the UNC School of Law down the street here. She's the director of clinical programs and the director of the Youth Justice Program. And one of the special reasons we wanted her here today is that she now serves as a member of the Chapel Hill Carrboro City School System. She's on the Board of Education there, elected a few years ago. And so we thought it would be really useful to have someone who not only has studied a lot educational systems in North Carolina and other states, but also has worked with public school systems through her legal expertise and now actually serves as a voting member of an elected board of education to give us kind of her perspective. So we're really excited about that, and thank all of you for joining. To get us going today, we thought we'd kind of break things up in three pieces. First, Heather will kind of do an overview of charter schools very quickly. We've asked Professor Fetters if she would then take over and kind of talk a little bit about the purpose of our report and some of the findings and recommendations. Then we want to leave time for our guests to ask questions of any of us. As we get to the end of this, our goal is to end at 1 p.m., but we will try to save some time for questions and answers. When we get to the question and answer part, if you would, you can just stick your questions into the chat mode. That will be the easiest. I'll make sure that I keep an eye on that, and we'll try to make sure that we answer everything. At the end of our presentation day, we will save this recording, and we will be willing to share it out with our guests along with our slide deck. And if we aren't able to answer any of your questions today, we will do it on our email to you with these materials, okay? So I think that's covered all the housekeeping things. And Heather, if you don't mind, I'd let you to go ahead and get started and give us a little bit of a background here.
Thanks, Yvonne. So before we jump in, I just want to share with you all, we're going to share this at the end as well, but this is the report that we're going to be discussing today. It just came out in May, the North Carolina Charter Schools Undermining Quality Education for All. And you can find it on our website. If you go to our website and just go to the issues menu, drop down at the bottom, there's charter schools. It's the first link right there up at the top. It's a very thorough report, and we hope you all take some time to peruse it. It's got a lot of excellent information about the history of charter schools and what's happening today in North Carolina around charter schools. So I'm just going to give a brief overview. Charter schools are publicly funded elementary and secondary schools. They're operated by nonprofit organizations, but these nonprofit organizations, in many cases, they do partner with private organizations. So we often think about charter schools as one step or one component of the privatization process. They are completely distinct from vouchers, however. We often get questions about when we're talking about vouchers, well, what about charter schools? Charter schools and vouchers are completely different. Vouchers are for paying tuition or dealing with private school education, and they are paid for by tax dollars, but not the way charter schools are. And so charter schools are publicly funded. They are free to attend, unlike private schools. However, the big distinction between traditional public schools, and we make an important distinction between traditional public schools and charter schools. Charter schools operate with far fewer regulations than traditional public schools. And so we have this handy chart here. I'm not going to go through every row, but you can see that a lot of important regulations that are followed by traditional public schools are opt-in or opt-out by charter schools. However, they are required to participate in the accountability program, which is really nice because then we can get a sense of how well they are providing academic opportunities and educating students based on results on the end of course and end of grade tests. So they are required to administer the end of grade and end of course tests. However, they are not governed by community elected school boards. So as you all know, everyone gets to elect our traditional public school board members, everyone, whether you have a student in the school or not. That's not the case with charter schools, and obviously it's not the case with private schools either. They're not required to use a standard course of study. However, it's in their best interest to do so since the end of grade tests are aligned to the standard course of study. Charter schools don't have to follow school calendar law, and school calendar law is a really important piece in our traditional public schools because the school calendar law right now dictates when schools can start in the fall and when they can get out in the spring, and sometimes that doesn't align very well with the community's needs. Charter schools don't have to follow that. Charter schools also don't have to follow the state law on restriction on class sizes in K-3, so they can have as many students as they want in those grades. So I'm not going to go through the whole list, but you can see the presentation afterward and look through those. Charter schools in North Carolina first opened in 1997, and the law guiding that provided for charter schools was very specific, and there were some very specific purposes. So charter schools were open so that they could provide an avenue for improving student learning. The notion was that these charter schools would, innovate and provide new and exciting and innovative and more effective instruction for kids. They were intended to increase learning opportunities for students, encourage the use of different and innovative teaching methods. They're supposed to create professional opportunities for educators and provide parents and students with expanded choices. So as we're thinking about charter schools now, we should really think back to the purpose of why this legislation was passed in the first place, and are our charter schools meeting those legal requirements? Are they actually providing innovative methods that are not already provided for in the public schools? So the initial cap was 100 charter schools. In 2011, despite the fact that there was pretty uneven implementation and student outcomes, lawmakers decided to get rid of the cap. And since then, like right now, the charter school, they doubled pretty quickly up to 200. And now the number of charter schools hover around 210, 208, 211 over the past few years, because as some charter schools open, others are closed and their charters are revoked or they're voluntarily closed. So there's this continual churn in the charter school numbers, which is not good for students to have their school close abruptly, which some of these do. So what's happened now in North Carolina is we now have a public school system, public, free, fully funded not fully, by the state legislature, two private systems of education: charter schools and traditional public schools that are tuition free. The North Carolina Constitution requires that the General Assembly fully provide for one uniform system of free public schools. And right now we're operating two: one that follows all state law and the regulations, and the other one the charter schools that don't have to follow all the regulations. And that raises some issues that we discuss in the report. And I'm going to turn it over to Barbara now to talk more about the report and some of the things that we share in the report, some of the findings.
Great. Well, first I wanted to say thank you to Doctors Brannon and Coons for inviting me to work with them on this report and participate in this webinar. Public Schools First is obviously a really important organization, that we have great thought partners and advocates. And as Dr. Brannon indicated in her introduction, I come at this issue with a couple different lenses. One is just as a researcher of the intersection between different systems, most specifically school systems and juvenile justice. Two is at our clinic here at UNC, we have represented students who are at charter schools and who are then excluded, and so have had a firsthand view of the negative impact on them, their families, and really often the public schools to which they are returning, for reasons that we'll get into in a little bit. But I think most powerfully, the way in which I've seen how charter schools undermine kind of public schools more generally as a school board member, through impacts on our budget and the ways in which the lax regulatory structure to which charter schools are subject really unfairly, often advantage them. And so it ends up being this kind of apples and oranges thing where people are like, oh, the charter schools seem so much better, but they have the rules of the game are just not the same for public schools and charter schools. And so we can't really make fair comparisons. I just wanted to, before I am going to talk about what's here on the screen, but I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on the growth in charter schools that Heather mentioned. So we have the fifth highest growth rate in the nation in our charter school population. For this school year alone, charter schools got 1.2 billion of the 12.6 billion allocated in state funding, and that number doesn't include federal and local dollars. And obviously, as the charter school population goes up, the public school population goes down. And so in this same period, student enrollment in public school districts has decreased by 4%. And so currently, the National Center for Education Statistics says that we have the 8th most students enrolled in charter schools and the 14th highest percentage of our students in charter schools among all 50 states. All right, so the report has we call it deeper dives into these 4 principal issues, really all of which are facilitated by the comparatively loose laws and policies that govern charter schools. So segregation, problematic student discipline, high rates of school closures, and closely connected to that, lots of examples of financial mismanagement. And so just unpacking this a little bit about how charter schools don't serve all students. So in particular, charter schools have they're whiter, they're more racially segregated, they serve fewer students with disabilities, fewer multi-language learners, and fewer economically disadvantaged students. So why might that be? Let's talk about race first. So you might say, and you would be correct, well, the public schools are not all that diverse either. And neither are many of our neighborhoods and our communities. And as folks on this webinar probably know, the Supreme Court of the United States has removed a lot of the most powerful tools that we would otherwise have to make our schools less segregated. But charter schools are even worse. So a couple of reasons why we think that might be. So prior to 2013, state law required charter schools to actually reflect the demographic populations of the school districts in which they were located. But in 2013, that law changed to just basically say they have to try. And so, unsurprisingly, you can see how that plays out in these numbers from 2023, 2024. So they're both whiter and then in some places more racially isolated. So with higher percentages of white students, and then schools that have almost no white students. And the charter schools alone, it's unfair to blame them for this. The state isn't doing anything to enforce even this very modest requirement that charter schools make reasonable efforts to have their population reflect their school districts. So most obviously, what is a reasonable effort? And why aren't those efforts required before the schools even open, for example, in how they market and recruit? What components do these efforts have to include? Do they have to be research-based? And do Office for Charter Schools staff have the training and expertise necessary to effectively review the plans? Maybe they do, but we can't know because none of this is public. So before we talk about discipline, I wanted to just talk, and you can just, this slide is fine, but there are other ways in which the schools are segregated. So there are far fewer students with disabilities, and the students with disabilities who are in charter schools tend to have needs that are less expensive to meet. Why might that be? Well, a couple of things. So first, one response to critiques like this from folks is often, well, there's a lottery to get in, so how could they possibly be discriminating? But in fact, there are selective admission criteria that mean the charter schools can crowd out students who might be more expensive to serve. So for example, they are permitted to give preference to siblings of currently enrolled students. They are also allowed to give preference to students who were in preschool programs operated by the school in the prior year, the child or grandchild of somebody who's employed full-time by the school, or who was enrolled in another charter school in North Carolina in the previous school year, or who has a parent or legal guardian on active military duty. So those folks all get preference, meaning the lottery is not really a lottery. And then I think there's also a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes, which is that there's a perception that charter schools don't have what they need to serve students with disabilities, and so those students are not applying. As for why there might be a smaller percentage of students for whom English is not their first language, the Office of Charter Schools itself has even said that sometimes marketing materials are not available in languages other than English. And as for economically disadvantaged students, as Dr. Kuhn showed us in that first slide with the chart, charter schools may but need not provide free and reduced lunch, and they may but need not provide transportation. And so those are two pretty significant barriers that would keep a socioeconomically diverse population from being at a charter school. All right, so here we are on the exclusionary discipline slide. And here again, public schools have not always done great in this regard. There has been, a trend recently, though I would say happily seem to be moving away from that trend, certainly in my school district. We have been trying very hard to find use restorative practices rather than kicking kids out of school because of just the avalanche of research showing how bad it is for a child to be removed from a class, even for a short amount of time. So I think things could be better in the public school districts, but what goes on in charter schools is unique because they are subject to the same laws if they're trying to just subject a child to in-school or out-of-school suspension or even to expel them. But they also have this little carve-out, which just says a charter school may exclude a student who is not complying with the terms of its charter, with very minimal reference to due process. And this is an area that has not been litigated at all. And so I suspect that lots and lots of students are being, whether formally or informally, excluded under this provision. And we represented a student who was in this position, and it was pretty infuriating to hear the reasoning of the charter school operators, because basically what they said was, well, we're not depriving this child of anything because they can just go to their base school tomorrow. And the kind of obvious rebuttal to that is like, you can't both try to be special and different and get all these special rules that you get to operate by, and then say, but you can just go back to your regular school and it won't be make any meaningful difference to you. And so in the case of the student that we represented, for example, he didn't get to go to the prom he was planning to go to, be on the teams he was planning to be on, or be with any of his friends. And so that kind of logic is just really, to say the least, not informed by what we know about child and adolescent development. So, oh wait, yeah. Charter schools fail or they give up pretty often. So the state sometimes revokes the charters or just doesn't renew them. And sometimes charter schools relinquish them. And one might say, well, this is proof that the accountability structures are working because bad schools are closing. And while that may be accurate, I think it really understates the impact that school closure, particularly what Heather described as the churn of charter school closure, has on students, families, staff, and then entire communities. Like anybody who's a parent or a teacher knows what a big deal it is for a child to switch schools, even if it's just from elementary to middle or middle to high school, or when they move. But to have an entire school that you apply to and were excited about close, and then you're back in a place that your parents at least didn't want you to be, you can see how that's really a setup for the staff at the public school that's receiving that student primarily, but also the student themselves and then their families. So the reasons why charters are revoked or not renewed is findings that the academic outcomes are really bad, that there's fiscal mismanagement, that the enrollment is too low, and that sometimes that these schools are poorly serving students with disabilities. All right. So, I guess as an aside, I'm on the finance committee of our school board. And so I have seen, up close how much accountability and transparency there is in our budgeting process and how much oversight that there's a committee and then a school board and then the county. And so, we have full-time financial officers, and it is a big deal to responsibly manage a budget. And the report that I hope you'll get a chance to look at just has example after example of really what should be pretty big scandals about financial mismanagement. So schools not properly reporting to the IRS, schools not properly reporting to the state board, the Office of Charter Schools, examples of nepotistic hiring resulting in salaries that are way too high that then leads to an inability to make payroll and a closure. So you can see how some of these factors are really closely related to each other. And so the next slide kind of dives into the issue that Heather also previewed, which is the role of privatization, private equity, private companies in running charter schools. So it is true that charter schools themselves are nonprofit organizations, but they often contract with these for-profit management companies known as educational management organizations, or EMOs. Which is not what the kids mean by it. There are at least 11 EMOs operating in North Carolina, 7 of which are headquartered outside of the state. And some of these EMOs use what are called sweeps contracts, meaning that the school pays the organization much of the school's revenue for that corporation to then in turn turn around and provide all the services that the school uses. uniforms, other student accessories, finance, design, etc. And these management organizations often are kind of working hand in hand with the school to make sure that the folks who are on those boards, which, as we already discussed, are not elected by the public, are not going to meaningfully provide the kind of oversight that really should happen to these management organizations. So, there are pages and pages of recommendations in the report, and we had a lot of conversations before this webinar about what the most important thing is to focus on. And Yvonne was saying the original intent of charter schools was to be innovative. They were in the beginning run by small groups of teachers. There are lots of examples around the country of charter schools that were created to serve really very marginalized students that were being poorly served by public school districts, and some of them did quite well. But when about 30 years ago, the legislature removed the cap at 100 schools, and when the regulatory authority moved from the State Board of Education to the Charter School Review Board, the ability to hold charter schools accountable to that original intent, or really any intent at all, was dramatically diminished. And just as a fun little recent history lesson, in 2023, and I can do this because well, never mind. In 2023, when Trisha Cotham changed parties, you remember that? That is when some of the oversight moved from the State Board of Education to the Charter School Review Board. And that was when the requirement that had previously existed, that there be some showing that the creation of a new charter school was not going to harm existing public schools in the immediate proximity, that requirement was eliminated. And so you can see how kind of that's why we titled the report What We Did, which is that it's not so much charter schools per se, but the current regime of charter schools is making it hard to educate students both in a quality way, both within them and then back in public schools. So that's one, is have more meaningful oversight at the state level. Another is that it is really not okay for charter schools to not have to do the same thing that public schools do with respect to free and reduced lunch and transportation. It guarantees you a certain level of segregation. Same with that kind of loosey-goosey requirement that they just try to have the demographics reflect what the demographics are in the public school district. And then lastly, I think most reasonable people should agree that education is a public good and that private equity should have no role in an ostensibly public school like a charter school. And so these education management organizations, we think, should not exist. So those are three. We're happy to talk about folks' ideas or questions about others in the Q&A, but I think that might be a place to stop and have some conversation.
Excellent, Barbara. And let's do that. I want to see if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll get these, get right on it. But I think that one of the things that we do a lot at public schools first, where we are certainly concerned with the state constitution. North Carolina state constitution is one of the things that we're very proud of, and that in our constitution it says that every child is given the right to a free uniform public education. And so one of the things that we carry very deeply about is making sure that mandate from our constitution is upheld. So we do look very carefully at what traditional public schools are doing, what charter schools are doing, and certainly what private schools, the receiving school vouchers, are doing. But the public school charter issue is one that sometimes has become neglected by the media, I think. And so we thought it was really important when we're looking at this report to make sure that taxpayers, public education advocates, even parents really had a good understanding of what was going on in the charter school sector, especially those who are using charter schools or thinking about using a charter school. And I think that we tried to hit on those key things there. But let's see, I think we have a question here. Are public schools required to provide marketing information in languages beside English? That is the question.
Well, public schools don't market really. I mean, public schools enroll the kids who live in their districts. Federal statutes do require that public schools have language access to students whose first language is not English. So, and then the funding differences between charter and public schools, I think you said they are partially funded. I mean, I have some thoughts, but do y'all want to?
No, go ahead, Barbara, and we'll follow you on that one.
So schools receive a per pupil allotment from the state. And the way it works is that so for example, my school district, we then have to take some of what we get from the state and then move it to the charter school districts that are enrolling students who are in our district. So that is kind of how you see the drain. And so some people say, well, if they're leaving your school district, then you don't need the money, but we have to have certain things for all students that we have to have, whether we have 1 or 10, but we lose the money that we would otherwise get that we have to pay to charter schools that our students are not attending.
And Barbara, other things that you receive, fundings that you receive, grants or forfeitures, fees that come from the state that are given to public schools, do you have to share all of those things?
So I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
I
To
don't
an
want
extent,
to,
our understanding is that a lot of the local funds have to be done. Somebody asked about federal funds. Federal funds that come to charter schools would be those that they qualify to participate in. Title I is Title I. If you have Title I funding in a public traditional school and you have students who qualify, you would get that funding. The one thing that's really hard, and I don't think it's hard to understand, but it's sometimes hard to explain adequately. But when we're serving 80% or 85 or even 90% in some counties of the students, then that infrastructure that has to be there, and so the cost efficiency of so we lose one child here in third grade, one child in fourth grade, one child in fifth grade. The school system still has to provide a teacher for all those classes, right? So there's a economy of scales that gets harmed when public schools lose students erratically, I'd say, like randomly from different grades, different schools, different programs, but the building is still there. The bus still has to run, the teachers are still hired, the principal's still there. So the economy of scales is really messed up for a lot of school systems, especially the middle to small size counties and school districts are harmed the most. In fact, there have been several times when charter schools have opened literally across the street or down the road from a traditional public schools and harm that school enrollment to the point that they've had to lose teachers or lose classrooms or lose even close schools. And that is devastating because one of the things I'll just say, and I want my partners here to speak up, that what a public school cannot do is not ever be available. Barbara's example about the charter school saying, well, I'm sorry, we're letting you go, but go back home. So home has to always be there. And charter schools can open and close on a 5-minute notice. and literally some have closed at the end of the day, right? So they can close, and then guess what happens? Home base, your public school, does have to accommodate that child. And if they've closed schools or let a teacher go, now all of a sudden what happens when kids come back into a situation, often what happens is that they don't have a teacher, they have crowded classrooms because of that. If they close a school, then they're short the space, and building a new school is something that we cannot do with taxpayers in 10 seconds, right? So I think that the economy of scales is really a critical issue. The any other questions? I know that one of the things is Barbara said that you've been, one of the questions is you were working with the educational system through the discipline and the youth clinic you were run, and all the things you've done looking at the protections of students in education settings. But the question is, when you became a school board member, did understanding how charters impact schools change? Did you feel the heat or understand the issues a little bit better once you actually started serving on a school board and having to deal with the impact of charters and vouchers even in your school district?
I mean, yes, I would say we are fortunate in my district that not that many students go to charter schools, but some do. So yes, you can feel it. I would say more globally though, I think I didn't realize the significance of the school calendar until I got on the school board, but there are several reasons why being able to not follow the state mandate about a school calendar is advantageous to your student outcomes. So first, like our school district, the students, we end up with students having to take final exams after the holiday break, the winter break, because of when we can start and stop, which makes it so the break is not really a break. Second, for our high school students, especially, the fact that we have to start later means we are not aligned with community college schedules. And so that means that our students have to if they want to take community college classes, which is a really great opportunity, especially for students who are economically disadvantaged, but really for everybody, it is harder to do that with the misaligned schedules. And third, I think anybody who's affiliated with a public school, especially folks who are parents of secondary students, knows that there's this time at the end of the year after end of grade tests or AP exams where it's sometimes hard for there to be a lot of meaningful instruction because everybody is just kind of gassed. But if you were able to start the school year earlier, you could end at a more natural time when all these state required tests and AP exams are being administered. So that's just a few examples of what a big deal it is to not have to follow the school calendar.
Well, it is a big deal because well, a lot of the reason that a lot of high school kids have, even especially in the Triangle area, have moved to charter schools is because of the calendar. It is simply so that they can take, as many of you know, we have a lot of incredible kids in our school system in high school. A lot of them are dual enrolled now. They take classes at the same time at Wake Tech, Durham Tech, at the community colleges throughout the state. They take college level courses online if they qualify. So we have a lot of our students who need a flexible calendar and need a calendar that is aligned to what we're doing in higher ed. And that is a very big deal for our kids that are in grades 9 through 12. And a lot of kids talk about that. A lot of the other reasons they like to align is because of sports and summer jobs. A lot of our students saw a survey recently. It's incredible the percentage. I wish I could remember it right now, of our kids who work. A lot of them work to support their families, and some of them work to save for college. So that's really hard for them not to get out to the close to the middle of June and then have to start back so late. So these things are an issue. The other thing is that some of the folks are saying What are some of the things that we think would be make the system a lot better? And I would like to ask Heather and Barbara if they want to share some really concrete recommendations that we would have for how we can manage the charter school program better, uh, or improve it and or make it work more efficiently for taxpayers and for our children. So, Heather, I'll start with letting you've been doing a lot of research on this and your in-depth knowledge of what's going on in charters. Maybe you have a few things to add.
Well, before I go there, I actually want to follow up with the calendar conversation because there is actually a bill that made crossover, so it might actually become law, that would allow schools the choice of starting a couple weeks earlier, and then I think they would also have to end the last week of May or something like that. Barbara, I don't know if your board has discussed that at all. Um, but I wonder if that would solve some of the concerns that you were raising. Um, in my read of the law, it also would make it yeah, put in some um, punishments for districts that didn't follow that law, which I think is very interesting, given that charter schools don't have to follow that law. They're being pretty stringent for traditional public schools. But what your thoughts were on that? Because my read of it is you'd actually lose days overall, and you would have fewer school days, fewer professional development days. I don't know, Barbara, has your board seen that at all? I might just be too out. This not might not be a good question.
No, you're good. I think the North Carolina School Board Association has opposed it for those reasons.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah,
and
it's like a pig and a poke. It's
mhm,
like we're going to give you a little bit of pleasure here and it's going to hurt.
yeah.
Okay, so versus giving us the same, giving traditional public schools what they used to have for their entire existence until, about a decade ago, they had the ability to set their calendars locally by their locally elected school board. And guess what happens when you let the locally elected school board make decisions? You have input. You have public input, taxpayers have input, voters have input. They can not reelect the school board. They can come to a school board meeting and publicly speak and share their feelings. So one of the things that has always been, if we get back to the recommendations on how to improve things, one of the things that's really disturbing to me is that there is no elected board that represents the public or the taxpayers in how we govern the charter schools. And do I have a quick answer or solution for this? No, but I do think the fact that charters do not have to advertise on their website when they're having um, appointed board members meetings, I think that should be done. I think they should be open to the public. I think they should have a sign up opportunity for people to speak at their board members, just like Barbara, you have at yours, where you're required to have public comment and to allow people to have this. So I think that we have given them too much freedom and the lack of oversight. So I think one of the things we're saying is if you want to be called a public school, then you need to act more like a public school. You need to have full accountability to taxpayers and to parents. But Heather, I'll give you
Yeah.
the floor back.
Yeah, I just am going to some of the recommendations that we include in the report, and you asked for really concrete ones. So one that we have is really to put more information, make more information available to the public on the school's website. So for example, how long has the school been open? And I'm just going to go through the grades that are served by the school, the percentage of teachers that are teaching at that school that have a teaching license. So in North Carolina, there's a requirement for traditional public schools to hire licensed teachers or teachers who are working through that process of getting a license to the extent that they can. And that requirement is only 50% for charter schools. So what are the credentials of the educators there? That should be on their website. Also, what should be there? Should be available, easily found for the public. What transportation services are provided? Do they provide the meal services? Some charter schools honestly do a really good job of making this information available. Others do not. So it should be uniform so that they all are required to do this. what kind of school offerings are provided, and what's the extent to which those are different from the local public schools. So in some districts, they offer a wide array of academic programs. So how is this charter school adding or providing an innovative option to what's already available in the traditional public schools? So also available to everyone, the list of curriculars, clubs and extracurriculars, whether a uniform is required and what the cost is. And then if there are requirements for parents to volunteer. So those are things that could just go up on the website. It would provide parents with a lot more actionable information so they can make a more informed choice when they're thinking about a charter school for their student. Another thing that could happen very easily is for charter schools to have an open and public bidding process for contracts and to prohibit conflicts of interest in contracting. So if you have an EMO or an EMO that has a real estate company, a management company, and an apparel company, that school could not basically line its own pockets by requiring the students to purchase a uniform from the company that their company owns, and the kinds of sweep contracts that Barbara's talking about, we should get rid of all of those. And this was the recommendation, but it could happen pretty quick. It was on one of Barbara's slides. Remove the for-profit motive for some of these, because some of these are making millions of dollars for these operators, and those are dollars that should be going to educating students instead of lining the pockets of the operators. So those are a few very concrete, very quickly implemented recommendations.
And I really hope that everybody will take the time that this presentation today will whet your appetite for looking at the report and really looking through the recommendations. And we do have a lot in there about how to improve transparency and accountability, because the lack of those two things, I'm telling you, there's been a lot of financial waste and a lot of people profiting off of our kids and on our tax dollars. We also think that charter schools should serve all students. I'm going to kind of say them in summary. I won't read all the ones that we put in there. And I love what Heather said, is that, charter schools are supposed to be doing what public schools are doing, focusing on students, not on making profits, not cutting corners and offering settings or curriculum materials or instructors or educators or teachers at a cheap rate. And then, one of the things that we also are really concerned about is that there's no, this is, something I say too much maybe, but I'm very concerned about the oversight of the charter school itself. Who's running the charter school? Who's in charge? Who's the lead educator? Think about your school that you grew up in. Think about where maybe your grandchild or your own child is gone to school. There's a principal and there's an assistant principal, and they are vetted and hired. Their salary is known to everybody. Their qualifications is known to everybody. It's a public document. They are vetted, and then they're running the school. They are responsible to follow bidding laws. They cannot hire their own family members. We have a lot of charters where family members are if not the principal, then they're the first grade teacher or they're the bookkeeper. And so the things that we've put in place to protect children and protect taxpayers are not there in charter schools, who are calling themselves public schools but acting like private schools. And so we think that we need to level the playing field. The last thing I would say is that I think it's unfortunate for our school system that the system's been created to compete with public schools. I've actually heard legislators say, well, competition is good for our public schools. This is going to make them better. And of course, we know that's absolutely apples and oranges and not true. I think that when charter schools were first started, I was actually here, actually visited one of the first charter schools. And guess what? It was run by teachers. It was run by teachers who felt like they had a different approach to presenting the curriculum that they thought would really help children who were struggling academically. It was focused on complementing the school district, not competing. And so those are the opportunities that we were supporting, right? And that made sense. And then the goal was to transfer that learned knowledge back to the public school classroom. That has never happened. That has never happened. So, I guess our final recommendation is to put the cap back on public charter schools. Put the cap back on and make selection of public schools much more rigorous, transparent, and accountable, and make sure that these charter schools are run by competent educators, that they're following good, sound fiscal accountability and transparency, that they are treating all students fairly, and that they are allowing for public oversight. So, but we have so many other recommendations. We hope that you will look at our report. Heather, were there any other last questions that you saw that you would like to
No,
throw
I
out
just
to
wanted,
Barbara?
Barb,
Yeah.
if you had, yeah,
Oh,
Barb.
yeah, I
was gonna
did.
say
Well, I
something.
was going to respond. I think what I was going to say actually is responsive to the third and fourth questions in the chat, one about being bipartisan and the other about where's the best place to focus. And I think a lot of the recommendations that Heather just went through, for example, can be implemented in the current regulatory structure that we have. So like through the Office for Charter Schools, the Department of Public Instruction. I also do think the Charter School Review Board, which is composed disproportionately by people who are vested in the current charter school regime, which includes profit motives, they should have less power. And so that, and then the cap really is a General Assembly, a North Carolina General Assembly initiative that has to happen. And I think charter school support has come from Democrats and Republicans. So I think this is a intellectual paradigm shift that has to happen. And I guess the point I wanted to make, which I think has been touched on but not really elaborated, is that yes, this is about good student outcomes, but public schools, really, along with public libraries, are some of the few civil institutions we have left that are kind of holding up democracy. And just come to a school board meeting and you get to see democracy in action, and it's messy and people get mad, but they at least have a voice in this institution that is educating children, even if they're not their own children. They're children who are going to become adults and are going to have some role in running the country and keeping us a democracy. And so I feel like that aspect of what public school was supposed to be, and when compulsory education was created, in the 19th century, which is that the school is meant to be a fundamental component to a civil society and a democracy. You do lose that when you have these privatization aspects of charter schools that we've kind of gone through. And so I just wanted to elevate that issue as well. It seems timely.
Thank you.
At
Yeah.
the very core of what we are doing,
Well,
why
it's
we're here, and why we're
essential.
advocating to protect public education and public schools. And thank you, Barbara, for saying that so well. Because at the end of the day, what are we really concerned about? We're really concerned about losing our public school system. When the state constitution calls for a uniform system of public education, and now we've created systems, right? We've pulled off from the instead of strengthening and working to improve, to strengthen, to address those things that need improved with the funding they need. We've pulled off to this charter school model. We'll just come over here. We won't fix the problem. We'll just come over here and have another system. And now we have private school voucher system that's going on. Another alarming trend that's happening across the country is that a lot of charter schools are deciding they'll now just become private schools because they have even less rules to follow, less curriculum and standards to worry about. In fact, our private schools have none of those. And so we look soon for a report that Heather's working on about vouchers, because now that's going to be a third system that the taxpayers are having to pay. And is this truly efficient? And does it meet the public common good? No. And is it a threat to our public schools? Yes. This question from George says, where to put our focus? The GA? Yes. Absolutely, because unfortunately, local school boards, those that are ruled by Republicans and ruled by Democrats, all really want one thing. They want to serve the kids in their community, and they want the funding to do so. They are not making these laws. These laws were being made in North Carolina General Assembly, and often being made by small group of people. So I think, yes, George, we have to focus in the General Assembly. We have to say to them, as taxpayers, we deserve to have our taxpayer dollars spent wisely. If you look at what's going on with charters and vouchers, we are not spending our tax dollars wisely. We are underfunding our public schools, and we're paying for it, right? In ways that are not good. And so that's where you have to focus. So back to wrapping this up. I'm telling you, I could listen to Barbara Fetter's talk all day long, because she's so brilliant and she's so well informed about so many issues around public education and the law. And so I hope that you will snag her. It went real fast, but I hope you snagged her email. And if you have questions, send them directly to her. If you need and want other questions about data, Heather is the researcher extraordinaire. She remembers facts and figures like no one I've known before, but we would be happy to share with you any information we have. And we really hope that you will go back to the report and look it over and look at some of the recommendations, talk to your legislators, and really get involved in making sure that what Barbara said remains true. Our public schools are an institution in every community, the heart of the community. And keeping those public schools strong and open and available is really key to our democracy, key to our economic development, and key to our social and economic well-being in this state. And I guess, Heather, I'll let you get to that last slide now. Y'all, we are a small group of dedicated, passionate public advocates, and we can use your help. And one of the biggest things you can do is just to follow us, share our information on, Facebook and Blue Sky and TikTok, get our newsletter so that every week you can stay informed of what's going on in the General Assembly and ways that you could be involved. And, just support us by sharing your questions and your ideas and your suggestions for things that we could do to keep advocating for public schools. Our goal, our mission is to educate, inform, and engage North Carolinians about what's going on in our public school system. We thank you for coming today. Barbara, it's always a pleasure to work with you and talk with you. Heather, thank you again for all the hard work you and Barbara did making this report happen, and letting me just moderate your brilliance. So thank everybody for coming today. And looking for your email to get some of the follow-up materials. Thank you all. Bye-bye. Thank y'all.